So before we can actually start the work of reducing the stigma attached to abortion, it's helpful to understand what stigma is and how it works. So let's start there. So stigma as a concept is defined as the shared understanding that something is morally wrong or socially unacceptable. I kind of think of it as this negative fog or this dark cloud that surrounds a topic, kind of a general vibe that something is bad or wrong, right? So many things in our society, besides abortion, are stigmatized. You have HIV, positive HIV status, mental health, obesity, immigration status, teen pregnancy. The list goes on because Americans are really good at stigma. And the thing about stigma is that you as an individual don't need necessarily to disagree, you don't need to agree with the wrongness of the topic, right? You might think the topic, in this case abortion, is fine, not problematic, no big deal, or you may not have even thought about it very much. But the world around you says it's not okay, and you can't help but absorb those messages. So stigma is really devious because it creates this self-reinforcing loop. So when something is stigmatized, people with that attribute are often labeled. They're stereotyped, they're somehow seen as less than, us normal people. And there's a general narrative that there's something wrong with you, that you're lazy or you're careless or they're somehow your fault to have this stigmatized attribute. And this pushes people to feel shame. And I want to distinguish really briefly between the idea of shame and the idea of guilt. So guilt is another unpleasant emotion that no one wants to have. But guilt is about your actions. I did something wrong, I made the wrong choice. But I can learn from that, do something differently next time. Shame says, I'm a bad person. There's something inherently flawed or deeply wrong about me. So again, as an individual, you might not feel that shame internally, but all the messages around you tell you you should. And when the world is telling you should feel bad about something, do you walk into a room sharing it, stigma first? My father was incarcerated, or I take medication for bipolar disorder, or I had an abortion. Generally speaking, people don't, right? They hide that experience, they hide that attribute, they stay silent. So now we're in this third part. And that silence then reinforces stigma. Because folks can walk around saying, well, I don't know anyone who had an abortion. And abortion suddenly becomes something theoretical or something for those people. But trust me, if 1 in 4 women have had an abortion in their lifetime, you know someone who's had an abortion. And the most effective way to disrupt this cycle is to break the silence. So some of you are now getting the skeptical look on your face, thinking, well, we talk about abortion all the time. But if you think about it, those conversations are typically kind of talking head conversations on TV. They talk about abortion from a philosophical or a theological point of view, but they rarely talk, in fact, are often completely disconnected from the real life experience of real people's abortions, right? So when real people talk about their real experiences with abortion, even with one other person, but ideally with 2 or 10 or a period of time 50, that can change the conversation on a national level about abortion. So that's the silence we want to break. We want to start millions of conversations. So the first thing we can all do as potential stigma busters is just to talk about abortion more often. Say the word, share facts and information, be brave, step into these conversations. The second thing we can all do is tell stories. Our own, if it feels safe in any given situation. Others that we've heard if we are very careful about privacy. Because we as humans, you'll probably agree with this, think we change our minds based on facts. But any psychologist, any marketing expert, any con man is going to tell you that stories are what change people's perspectives. Now, obviously, there's a lot of institutional and policy level work that we need to do to reduce stigma. But that work is easier and it's more effective if we also do this educating and storytelling work at the same time. So that's what stigma is and how to break the cycle. But if we're going to be effective stigma busters, we have to be able to spot stigma when it's happening so we can actually do something about it. So it's helpful to know that stigma can happen on many different levels. So it can happen on an intrapersonal level, which is what we say to ourselves about abortion decisions. And because everyone has a different life experience, a different culture, different background, this can play out in different ways. So it might look like a person of faith worrying that they're immoral or that God is going to judge them for their abortion decision. Or it might look like an avowed supporter of abortion rights who judges herself for feeling sad about her own abortion. Stigma can also occur interpersonally, right? So this might be if I were talking to a friend about my experience and she said to me, oh, well, in your situation, it totally made sense, right? So she's being supportive of me, but her narrative about the type of people who normally get abortions is packed with stigma. Stigma can occur on a community level, like what your faith leader says from the front of your church or your temple or your mosque, or what a teacher says, or usually doesn't say, about abortion when they're teaching sex ed. Community level stigma often plays out on the assumption that everyone around you agrees with the stigma. So this is the situation when other parents at my kid's school find out what I do, and they kind of sidle up to me and they do the whole, I'm a supporter, right? Like they're not the fifth person to do this month. There's an assumption that other people wouldn't agree with that. So stigma can happen on an institutional level. To pick a completely not random example, this might be a company that does electronic medical records, and they hide all the abortion-related screens on the OBGYN package, and you have to ask specially to turn them on. Or when an insurance company requires pre-authorization for abortion, but not for comparable medical procedures. And then lastly, stigma can occur on a societal level in the stories that we tell and how we tell them. So like when movies portray abortion as this angst-ridden and painful choice, or they show health centers that provide abortions as these kind of sketchy, not very nice looking places. And then just to make it more complicated, all these levels interact with each other, right? So if you're in a community where just saying the word abortion is taboo, it's hard to point out the institutional stigma if your employer's insurance covers Viagra and doesn't cover abortion, right? And don't forget that stigma doesn't just affect people who have abortions, but also people who provide abortions and people who work for abortion-providing organizations. So I work for Planned Parenthood, and for me, this work is a moral calling. I cannot imagine more important work for me to do with my life. Yet I still constantly navigate whether to disclose where I work or not. Can I tell my kids' teachers, or it will affect how they are treated in the classroom? Can I tell my mechanic, because he's fixing my brakes? Can I mention this cocktail party, or will I be shunned? So even though I know 7 in 10 people support abortion rights, I don't want, even though among those 7, their negative assumptions about abortion reflecting back on me or on my children. And this, let's be real, is not something that people who work in dental care or plastic surgery have to think about, right? Because we wouldn't have this conversation if we were talking about dental hygiene. Like if this were a dental hygiene session, you guys would all go out tomorrow and you'd be talking with your friends and neighbors and like, healthy teeth this, healthy teeth that, and people would be like, all right, she's a little passionate, but whatever. But it's harder to do that with abortion because of stigma. And that's what we're collectively working to change, one conversation at a time. Thank you.